Hi everybody, this is Mr. Burns, and we're going to take off with another lesson where we were last talking about the Mexican War, and at the end of the Mexican War in 1848, the United States acquired a lot of territory. And one of the most important pieces of this territory was California. And actually, the acquisition of this land is going to help lead to our own Civil War, the worst war in American history. So let's kind of start walking down that pathway to find out more about those events. So they found gold in California, and in the year after that gold was found, thousands of people came from all over the world to California, hoping to strike it rich in those gold fields. California is able to apply for statehood. And the southern states were really worried about this because this would destroy the balance in the Senate. Since 1820, the numbers between slave and free states had always been equal. And now, with California coming in, there's going to be more free states than slave states. This is going to lead to a major political crisis. If they had not solved that political crisis, it potentially could have led to war. So let's see what that political crisis was all about. We'll start with Zachary Taylor. He was the president of the United States. The Mexican War had made him president. He was a hero. The Whig Party ran him, and he was easily elected. The South might have thought old Zachary is going to kind of stick up for them because, first of all, he's a Southerner. He has a plantation in Louisiana, and on his plantation, he has hundreds of slaves. So you think that he might have been kind of sympathetic to the South. That's not the reality of things, though. Taylor, he was a nationalist. So that word nationalist there, if I highlight that, a person who is a nationalist puts their country before other things. So he looked in terms of what's going to benefit the country more than what would benefit the slave states. He was also kind of a law and order kind of person. So as president, California had thousands of people living there. It was enough to become a state. So it should come in as a state. Now, why does that scare the South? Well, as I said before, the South really controlled the Senate because they could block any law in the Senate. So if anything was passed that could weaken slavery, they could stop it there. Now, with California coming in as a free state, there was that potential that they could no longer stop these kind of laws from being passed. The picture on the right shows a very ill Zachary Taylor, and in the summer of, I believe it was 1850, he got really sick. He had attended a 4th of July celebration, and there's descriptions of him chugging down iced milk and eating large numbers of cherries. Somewhere in that food that he probably ate was contamination of some sort of other. It could have been excrement because sanitation wasn't very good in those days. And within hours, he was struck with intense stomach pains and he had a very high fever. You read kind of people speculating about what it could have been, and cholera and typhoid come up a lot. So President Taylor falls deathly ill and he passes away. It's a tragic thing, but for the country, it was probably a good thing because it allowed compromise to take place. Taylor was not going to compromise. California should come in as a free state and nothing else. And he didn't care how upset the southern states were with that. So we're looking at Zachary Taylor, and Zachary Taylor's position was that California should immediately come in as a state. In the Senate, a very old man comes back to the Senate, and he's known as the Great Compromiser. So once again, Henry Clay is trying to hold the country together. And he comes up with what he calls the Compromise of 1850. And some of the important parts of this Compromise of 1850 are, California is going to come in as a free state. to make Southerners happy with that and to go along with it, he offers up a strong fugitive slave law. Now remember, slaves, especially in states that bordered on free states, often ran away. So, what this fugitive slave law is saying is that the federal government will have special officers, and these officers will track down and capture runaway slaves, and they will return them to their owners in the South. This was very popular in the South, and among many people in the North, it was unpopular. So, in the North, you saw lots of people that wouldn't cooperate with officers trying to catch runaway slaves, and you had some states that also said that they weren't going to allow this to take place on their lands. The other thing about the fugitive slave law is I could have run away from slavery and I could have been living in Philadelphia or New York or Boston as a free man or a free woman for 20 years or 25 years, and now all of a sudden my freedom is at stake. I could be arrested and be brought back to the South and be put back in chains as a slave. Another thing that was a part of the Compromise of 1850 is that the slave trade, these slave markets, were going to end in Washington, D.C. So you wouldn't see human beings on the auction block being sold. It was still legal to own a slave in Washington, D.C., but the slave trade was going to stop. The last thing, and it's probably the most complicated thing here, is, well, what do we do with the rest of these territories that we got from Mexico? Now, many people in the North, abolitionists in particular, said there should be no slavery in these lands because Mexico didn't have slavery. Slavery was illegal in Mexico. And so it would be morally wrong to let slavery expand into these lands. Southerners wanted to see them open for slavery. Henry Clay, kind of in his Compromise of 1850, punts on that issue. So what he comes up with is, hey, we'll just let the people of the territories decide at the time when they apply for statehood whether they were going to come in as a slave state or a free state. So this was called popular sovereignty. We're just going to let the people of the territory vote on the issue. So it's not going to be a presidential thing. It's not going to be a law passed by Congress. It's not going to be a decision that comes down from the Supreme Court. Try as he might, Henry Clay just could not get his Compromise of 1850 passed. It always failed in the Senate. So he's old, he's sick, he's tired. He just kind of gives up and goes home. The last thing that we'll take a look at is another senator, and he's had an important part in American history. He's been the chief defender of slavery ever since the late 1820s, and that's John C. Calhoun. And you see John C. Calhoun seated in a chair here. He was actually, even in even worse shape than Henry Clay. He was a sick and dying man in 1850. He worked on his own idea of a compromise, and here we see his compromise thoughts being read to the Senate. He was so sick that he couldn't stand up and read his ideas. He had to have, somebody do that for him. So Calhoun was opposed to compromise of any kind. He thought, the United States, we need to have a bunch of constitutional amendments that are going to protect the South and some constitutional amendments that are going to guarantee that slavery can exist in this country forever. So his ideas were definitely in the minority, and they had absolutely no chance of passing. So you see this, we have a real strong impasse here with the president saying one thing, Henry Clay trying to run another compromise through the Senate and it failing, and John C. Calhoun even coming forward with even more ridiculous ideas that had no hope of all to pass through the Senate and be signed by the president. So it actually looked like maybe war was coming in 1850, where the southern states and the northern states might go to war over this issue of California, slavery, freedom, and such.